Hi everyone, my name is Burak Arikan. Thanks to Dina and the Berkeley Center for New Media inviting me. It's great to be here, and I'm quite honored to be part of the great panelists here. I'm going to talk hopefully briefly about a couple of works of mine. These art projects and the platform Graph Commons very briefly. I think in relation to civil society and politics. And when I look at my own work in the past, maybe 10, 15 years, I saw myself like dealing with this problem, what I call like data asymmetries. This is like a term that I derive from economics, like of what's called information asymmetry. When you have a contract with some third party, if you know more about the contract, you have more advantages on that contract. This is usually called information asymmetry, which creates advantages and so on and so forth. So in data asymmetry, like I'm interested in like concepts like how much data is being collected about myself or about our society by those the corporations and governments, and how less we have about how less data we have compared to them. Basically, it's quite asymmetric relationship. So I'm going to talk about a couple of projects here. Like one is what I call Islam, Republic, and Neoliberalism. It's a triptych. It's about the dominant ideologies that exists in Turkey, where I'm from. So I picked up three architectural symbols for each of these ideologies that are like manifested in their architectural elements. So I'll just talk about one of them, the Islam, which I think is quite interesting. So look at this postcard view of Istanbul. It's very common. You see, the amazing mosques and beautiful waterside, and all that. Quite a touristic image, actually. So what's interesting here is that when you look at this map, something you will notice that if you've ever been to Istanbul, so it's an Islamic city. So every 5 times a day, you will hear a call to prayer sound from those minarets of those mosques, and this sound travels a lot, like around 300 meters. That's 1,000 feet more or less. To its surrounding in the space. If you look at them from top, you will see there are many mosques in Istanbul, more than 3,000, and their distribution in the city is very interesting. And I started looking at this particular pattern. So if you're a tourist, visiting Istanbul, you can find it quite magical, like hearing these sounds from all locations, and it's quite interesting soundscape. But if you're living in a city, as a local, it doesn't matter too much. It's like background noise for you, if you're not religious, especially. So I started looking at these different, mosques where they are located in the city, and I made a little calculation. If their sounds overlap, that's around 1,000 feet around the radius around each mosque. I started making these network nodes between them, created lines between them. So because suddenly they become vectors, basically, and they're connecting to each other. So when you look at these maps, every node is a mosque and has a name on it. You can see them, you can read them in different languages actually. And some of the mosques are quite old, like a couple of thousand years, and others are very new. And if you zoom out a little bit from, you see this very dense area, which is the old peninsula, which is from the Byzantium Empire, Byzantium times. There are still mosques from 1400s after post-Byzantium times. Aside from these historical mosques in the old peninsula, which is not necessarily a crowded area, by the way, it's just because there are mosques there. It's just the symbolism, I guess, kind of dominated in this area. If you zoom out a bit more, you start seeing less, dense areas. And if you zoom out a bit more, this is the entire Istanbul, and you'll see the distribution of these mosques everywhere, and you'll see also some grid structure a bit like outside of the city. And this is because the government is systematically building these mosques. It's not just, the communities in the neighborhood want a mosque for their neighborhood. It's just government puts another one there right away, because it's a systematic program of the state, actually. It's like beyond the government, it's like a state action, probably. This is my kind of finding from this research. And I was thinking of these network of mosques as like a mediator of the ideology in the city, ideology of Islam. But I never imagined authorities can use these mosques literally for asserting their power. And until this moment, in 2016, July 15, we have a coup d'etat. I was in Istanbul at the time. And the thing is, on the night of coup d'etat, from those minarets, we heard, instead of call to prayer, we heard call to square, and in Turkish. Normally, the prayer sound you hear from these mosques is in Arabic, and so you never like really listen them actually. It means you go to mosque basically. When it's in Turkish, it's very different. It's like, imagine the presidential alert we just got recently. It's just like that. You have an alert from the mosque, and that says come to the square. So it's very interesting. So people went to these squares. They actually fought, against the coup attempters, let's say, and then they lost their lives. There more than 250 people died, and 2,000 wounded. And of course, this call was, we never knew this was I would say a fake coup or not. It's like unknown to this day, and the reason is, it was carefully kind of co-opted back again by the Erdogan regime very easily, and in a single night, and then they had a new order, a new like state of emergency order right after that, and which obviously affected a lot of other things. In 2013, I was at the Gezi Park, where this is like the big occupation happened in Istanbul, and like the one in New York, where there was occupation of the park, the Scotty Park. In this moment, like we basically were, all of us, like we were in the park trying to defend the park against the construction company or the government. So they were trying to tear apart these trees on the park, basically, and there were like many people defending this, and we were there, like trying to do something, like some kind of a contribution to this resistance there. And so we organized a workshop, and there was me there, also Zeyno Üstün, who's here, and many other friends. And people who just heard about this, and then we basically get together and thought about what we can do about this problem we have here. So we started looking at the companies who wants to build this project on this park, and then we found out more information about this company. Who is this company? Actually, multiple companies, and who are the board members of these companies, and they also do like other projects with the government, other contracts, public private contracts. So we started looking at all this information and build these data sheets together. And the work was contributed by multiple people: lawyers, journalists, artists, designers, engineers, different types of people. And we built these type of maps where you can actually navigate the power relations between huge corporations and the government institutions, as well as things like media ownership, even labor crimes are all annotated on these maps. And here's some examples. Like for instance, you can. This is an interesting thing. When you make a map, a network diagram like this, you can start seeing indirect connections between different elements on the map. Which is very useful for that reason, and also you can start seeing clusters which are organically emerging from these relationships of networks of relationships. So it actually shows you clustering of power, also indirect relations among the power structures when the network is about power particularly. So we showed these maps in multiple occasions in different formats: prints, digital images, and website stories. And the thing about this, like every time a crisis happened or a chaos, emerged in Turkey, these could be like coal mine disasters or tapes leaked about Erdogan regime or something. People started looking at these maps because they couldn't find that information on the mainstream news. Obviously, it was never covered because that news media is already bought by these companies there. So people start using these maps as a reference to their own, to get knowledge or to get informed about this problem that they are in. So eventually I built this platform called Graph Commons, and this was used behind the scenes as a technology of this project. And in this platform, it's basically a general purpose system for collaborative mapping of data. And also publishing, obviously, at the same time. So there are many examples, like this is one from the Trumps, when the Trump elected, and there was a map of, data, different data sets were released about his candidates and for the government. And so we made these maps where you can see, as an example, Joshua Kushner's businesses and how much he's involved in actually in Silicon Valley in the investments of these giant startups that we know today. The Graph Commons system works really simple. What you see is what you get style system. You can just simply, click on the canvas, start making like links and nodes, and make connections between things, like the way you brainstorm, on paper and pen. And you define types of data. You kind of create your own ontology, and then kind of build on in that ontology whatever you want to build. People, I think right now we have more than 15,000 members using the system in different languages. Arabic, Portuguese, English, any other language. It's very international, and people make maps about archives, about their own local politics, a lot of different issues used for investigative journalism a lot, I can say, also used for archive researching, and also a variety of other cases. I'll continue very quickly here. Let's see. So one nice thing about this system is that it enables conversation or actually discussion around the maps as well. So on this right bar, you can see this map is particularly about the refugees the Syrian refugees in Turkey and their support network from different organizations, international, local, national levels. And it's done by a journalist, but this journalist made a call. I cannot find enough information because the government doesn't have or doesn't publish, even the UN doesn't publish enough information about this problem. So he kind of did a crowd contribution campaign, and people started adding their own data to this map, and that became a very nice resource again for this particular topic. And you can embed these maps into other sites in your blogs and stuff, make giant prints like this one, or it's used by journalists actually in a traditional way, like actually it was put as a cover on the paper. This was a very interesting one. It was like a corruption case happened in Turkey again. I helped with the journalists a bit to make up this thing, but they made this giant, a single, the cover of the newspaper, which was used in the universities as posters on the walls, kind of to create more awareness about this problem or particular problem at the time. I talked about the Trump map and just zoom some details about it. You can see individual profiles, who they are, these people are. You know them today very well, but not everyone is well known for everybody. And you will see, connections like big companies like Goldman Sachs is quite central, actually, in this Trump world of Trump. Let's say, and these people, they were actually ex-employees of Goldman Sachs, and obviously it connects to other investments to Kadre and Joshua Kushner there, and you can see more of them. The thing about this, like Graph Commons is used again, like people get influenced by each other. They see a map like this, they see another, they make another map. This one is about Brexit. It's called BrexNet. It's done by I think Drew Mackie. I don't know this person, but he's a UK person, and then he started bringing together data. It's about the collaboration on the influence, collaborations of different organizations and people, individuals on the Brexit campaign, basically. And you can see familiar organizations like Cambridge Analytica and others, and the political party themselves. Yeah, that's what it is, and I'm going to finish with some last idea. So I've been working with SFMOMA on this project called Civic Data Solidarity. It's basically kind of a next step for this Graph Commons project in a way. What we do is basically, I've been identifying these organizations around the world who collect data about certain issues, and they publish their own data about power systems, a variety of kinds. The idea here is to make bridges between them. Can we really connect their data sets to each other so that we can have our own big data, let's say, or our own civic data for or against power, basically. And the idea is like, these different fields we have, but they're not much connected. Everybody lives in their own, particular category and does work there and rarely communicates and collaborates with each other. So maybe having these data connections between those different issues, we can have a very interesting and a space for collaboration and a continuous collaboration among these different groups. Okay, this is what it is more or less. That's what I want to say. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Yeah.
Hi, happy Friday. Thanks for having me. I'm not going to have slides because one time I did a talk with Ted and they're like, don't have slides unless they really have something important to say on the images. I don't have pictures that are like that, so I'm just going to talk. And hopefully it's interesting enough for you to listen. If not, no big deal. My feelings won't be hurt. Cool. So I'm Erica Joy Baker, a senior engineering manager at Patreon, but you knew that already. You just heard that, so sorry for the repetition. Wikipedia calls civil society the, quote, aggregate of non-governmental organizations and institutions that manifest interests and will of citizens. To me, that sounds like activism. And I have to say, this isn't my normal wheelhouse. As you just heard, I talk a lot about diversity and inclusion in the tech industry. That's kind of what I go around and talk probably way too much about, but I think it's important. I'm usually in the role of activist, not talking about activism. And I like to talk about diversity and inclusion in tech because I think it is completely ridiculous on its face that any one group can be the gatekeepers for an entire industry. And yet that's the world we live in right now, and so I want to change that. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. What I want to talk about is how the tech industry helped us to get to where we are now, for better or worse. I like that phrase that we heard earlier, the uncivil society. Up until about 2010, people thought of Twitter as a place people go to tweet about food, and Facebook as the place that people talk to old classmates. In 2010, though, we saw Arab Spring begin, and enter a then Google employee, Wael Ghonim. During the Arab Spring, he founded a Facebook page titled "We Are All Khaled Said," supporting Khaled, a young Egyptian who was tortured to death by the police in Alexandria, Egypt. Wael took some time off from Google in January of 2011 to go to Egypt to participate in the Egyptian Revolution. And on January 27th, he was reported missing, having been kidnapped by the Egyptian authorities. He was released 11 days later and reignited the Egyptian Revolution movement. It was dying down at the time, and he went to Tahrir Square and basically used Facebook and Twitter to bring everybody together. He began rallying everybody around a message, and his efforts, in tandem with those of many others, were the first time we saw social media used to destabilize the regime. Do any of y'all remember that? Hosni Mubarak resigned. Yeah. So Ghanim's use of social media to play a huge part in Arab Spring was largely viewed as positive. The people used social media to organize grassroots efforts that resulted in a corrupt official resigning from office. And because of that good outcome, and I'm going to use good in air quotes because I know that goodness is subjective and some people may not agree that that was a good thing. Leaders at Facebook and Twitter took this as a win, and Google took it as a sign that they should build a social network. So fast forward to 2013, we saw Twitter and Facebook play major parts in the protests of the acquittal of George Zimmerman, and again in 2014 in the protests of the murder of Mike Brown. Links to Facebook events for marches were tweeted far and fast, and Dure's Blue Vest took the national stage, and the Black Lives Matter hashtag was frequently on the trending topics list on Twitter. And while Arab Spring and the Egyptian Revolution were the vanguard in using social networking to start a revolution, Black Lives Matter showed that social networking could be used to sustain a movement. Around the same time in late 2014, Gamergate was beginning. Gamergate was not, as many people like to say, about ethics in game journalism. It was the first large-scale, multi-platform, multi-target harassment campaign in the history of social networking. People used 4chan, Reddit, and Twitter to organize coordinated attacks, first against a woman for making a video game, and then against those who spoke up about the attacks and the rampant sexism in the video game industry. Gamergate was a lesson that social media could be used for organizing negative and hate-filled campaigns, not just the positive, world-changing ones. All of these events and those like them, whether positive or negative, should have been a red flag for the people running the companies, the Twitter and the Facebook. The most important questions people in tech should ask themselves about their tools is, how would someone use this for evil? That's the number one most important. And number two, do I care if they do? And the answer to that first question is obvious for social networks. But the answer to the second one for executives at that company, at those companies, and I would say for many tech companies, is no, they don't care. Executives at social media platforms like Reddit and Twitter have often touted their support of free speech as the reason for why they allowed the rapid harassment and brigading to persist on their networks. The reality is that the free speech justification made it easy for them to avoid having to address the truth of the matter. Controversy brings clicks. I strongly believe that the reason Donald Trump is still on Reddit, or on Twitter rather, and only recently did Reddit shut down some of its more toxic subreddits, is directly to do with getting more clicks for two reasons: growth and ad revenue. Google's runaway success with AdWords and AdSense sets a tone for the future of the internet. You made money by selling ads on your website. With the sophistication of ad trackers, you couldn't just have the ad on your site. You needed your site to be sticky. You needed people to stick around and to keep clicking around and to continue to be eyeballs. No eyeballs, no money. For better or worse, the controversies brought as many eyeballs as the good feel-good movements. In the case of publicly traded Twitter and Facebook, they also needed to show increases in daily active users, eyeballs, to make investors and shareholders feel happy. And how do you increase the daily active users? You make sure your site is always in the news, thanks Donald Trump, or you look away from the bot farms that you know are there. And that is how we got to where we are today. Nation-state actors have been, for some time, trying to destabilize America via the internet. My friend Frida Kapor-Klein says, genius isn't apportioned by zip code. And I'd like to build on that to say genius isn't apportioned by country either. There are very smart people all over the world. And some of those people are in places that aren't so hot in the US. And they recognize that the internet doesn't have all the pesky things like a military at the border or rules about who can buy access or airtime. The internet is a direct line to the American populace, and the American populace is clearly spending a lot of time online involved in movements, both positive and negative. No longer was it necessary to destabilize via military might. You just need to destabilize people, and no better way to do that than to hack their civil society to start movements. I use that in air quotes because they weren't really real. And so here we saw sock puppet accounts, and for those who don't know, a sock puppet account is someone using the face of someone else that's not really himself online. We saw the sock puppet accounts and bot farms gear up. The sock puppets started Facebook groups and made tweets that effectively aped the grassroots efforts we saw in Arab Spring and Black Lives Matter. The bots amplified these groups, posts, and tweets until real American residents began seeing them and glomming onto them. So you had left-leaning people attacking Hillary Clinton with fake memes and attacks meant to weaken her position. And that was wild to me personally, because I had friends who were like Bernie Sanders supporters, and like we were all supposed to be on the same sides, but they were like sharing these memes that were clearly not true. And so when websites like Snopes pointed out the falseness of these claims spread by these networks, well, the bots focused their attentions on Snopes and basically called it a tool of the liberal machine. And soon it was just disbelieved, and truth and facts were now points to be debated. During this time, people began trying to get the attention of the powers that be at social networking companies to tell them that something was amiss. They were recognizing the patterns of a bot network, that identical messages were being sent by people who seemingly had no connection whatsoever to each other. I cannot speak for what happened inside those companies, but I can say that entire lists of bot accounts were delivered to Twitter and Facebook prior to any investigation by the US government into interference with the election, and even before the election, and those lists were ignored. Here's where I will speculate that given the choice between A, saying your company was being used as a tool by bad actors, B, saying that a significant portion of your users are in fact bots, C, saying that your DAUs and ad numbers are wrong as a result, and D, reducing your traffic as a result of reduced controversy, or just ignoring the problem, the leadership of those companies chose to ignore the problem. And so how do we get out of this place, right? We're in a big hole, and I don't have any positive warm fuzzies either. For starters, we have to get away from ad revenue supported internet and onto different payment models. Ad-supported internet has perverse incentives for companies running websites on the internet. Their number one goal will always be to sell more ads to more eyeballs. So they will always want to drive traffic, and it doesn't matter where that traffic comes from. Second, we have to encourage critical thinking amongst the people in our society. Currently, critical thinking doesn't have a place in our school curriculums until college, high school if you're lucky. Teaching people how to question what they're shown before they spread it can have a huge impact on the world, especially the world we live in online. And lastly, we need to keep having conversations like the one we're having today. We need to encourage people to recognize how the tools they're using work and how they can be used for good and bad and be used against them. Basically, we need to help people build mental firewalls so that prevents our society from being hacked again. Thanks.
Okay. Maybe the problem is we don't really live in a society, and what we live in isn't very civil. Perhaps civil society is not a thing to take for granted, or even hold out, frankly, as much of an ideal. The function of civil society was to displace the role of the church as mediator between state and private or domestic life. And the champions of civil society saw this as progress, but really civil society fulfilled much the same function as the church, of regulating a consistent order that applied to both state and private life, in place of the church fathers, a brotherhood of certain men. Now, civil society actually has two aspects. One is, let's make sure my slides are lined up, right? One is the realm of private interests interacting in a public space, the market. The model of civil society is essentially the market. The market magically turns private interest into public good. The other aspect of civil society is a little different. Secure in the pursuit of their private interests, a brotherhood of men of property can also deliberate on matters of state, but outside of the state. The free exchange of views and reasoning about them can determine the common good. Both aspects of civil society, as market and discourse, are defined by exclusion. Women are excluded as they are too close to the domestic sphere and irrationally governed by needs and desires, the eternal irony of the public sphere, as Hegel famously says. The uncivilized are excluded, and here that means those not of the city. The peasant is excluded, as is the provincial, and of course the uncivilized. You're going to have to keep doing this yourself, right? As possibly not fully human. The inclusion of men of reason in civil society is actually still premised on the exclusion of those who lack reason. Also excluded is the working class. Civil society is only the market and the men of means who trade on the market, property owners who are formally equal to each other. The sphere of production and exploitation is excluded from view, as are those men, women, at the time children, who labor in it. So civil society is an exclusive club and resides in an exclusive place, the city. For us Anglophones, it emerges out of the coffee houses where gentlemen could freely converse with each other without introduction. And gives rise to a new literary genre, the informal essay, perfected by Addison and Steele in The Spectator around 1711, 1712. Already civil society needs forms of media, starting here with the subscription newspaper. In the United States, components of the media system that make civil society as market and discourse function were codified in law and even the Constitution. Copyright was originally very limited in the United States, and indeed theft of intellectual property from Europe is one of the cheap inputs on which the independent colonies flourished, although you don't hear much about that these days. The role of the post office was also key. It was the biggest federal bureaucracy for a long time. And of course, First Amendment has already been mentioned. There's an intuitive understanding of the role of what will later be called information in the functioning of civil society, the state, and private life. Now, until recently, civil society as market and discourse was supposed to serve the state. The state's function is that of synthesis and adjudicator. As to whose interests the state synthesizes and adjudicates, well, that's determined by struggles for recognition among various classes. But from absolutism to constitutional monarchy to republics to the modern democratic state, civil societies serve the state. That may no longer be the case, and that would be the thing to question here. Civil society as market and discourse has had to adapt to a series of technical changes: advertising-driven newspapers, telegraphy, telephony, radio, television. They're all, as Harold Innes says, space-binding media, which bring more and more territory into simultaneous interaction and communication, threatening to overwhelm time-binding media such as church, university, culture, and even law itself. Civil society, where space-binding media are dominant, may be more destabilizing than deliberative and moderating. Each of these new media were dealt with in turn as distinctive regulatory problems by the state, which attempted to synthesize and adjudicate limits for them. And Nate personally spoke a little bit about this. In the United States, for example, telephony was a highly regulated private monopoly, whereas television was treated as a temporary license on the airwaves as public property, let's not forget. Also subject to regulation of the public interest, although it probably starts to fall apart early 80s, late 80s, early 90s. Now, most of this is ancient history now, but the key point would be that civil society as market and discourse was always an artificial creation, still subject to the state as synthesis and adjudicator of general interest. And it's within these artificial and also technical versions of civil society that all the great social and class struggles took place. The labor movement ran on the printed word. The suffragettes created dramatic media spectacles. The civil rights movement flooded into the domestic sphere through television and so on. These struggles made progress in part through civil society as discourse, but one regulated by the state. And in our language today, we could say they're all hacks, in the good sense. These were all struggles to break down the restrictions of civil society to gentlemen of means, and through civil society as discourse, assert the place of non-gentlemen to consideration by the state as voices to be included in its synthesis and adjudication. But to take part in civil society, one really needs private means. One needs civil society as market to provide one with the leisure to act in civil society as discourse. In Hannah Arendt's version of politics, it can only happen when there's freedom from necessity, or in other words, where somebody else does the work. Women, the working class, the colonial other, in a classical sense, slaves. Those excluded from civil society have resource then to two means to appear within it. One is through patrons. The abolitionists or the suffragettes had wealthy benefactors. We see again in recent times the rise of patronage as a form of granting access, but I think also the limits to it. Now, the other means is self-organization. Through the working class party or the social movement, the excluded build organizations that raise the resources to put their advocates into civil society directly as representatives. Or third option, spontaneous action which interrupts civil society as market, which stops its functioning until demands are met, the strike, Montgomery bus boycotts, and so on. But perhaps all that's in some ways a thing of the past. Maybe now there's a kind of techniques, an infrastructure, a vector which is not adapted to the old role of mediating between the domestic sphere and the state. Maybe it's the vector via which private interests finally escape the synthesis and adjudication of the state. This moment is sometimes called neoliberalism, meaning the transition from an era where the state regulated civil society to one where civil society as market regulates the state. But that, using that language may sort of actually obscure the sort of curious role of technics in this latest version of this. The internet was not really designed for humans, and it turns out humans today are still minority users of it. The internet was built so computers could talk to each other, and it became a civil society of discourse for the sciences, actually a bit by accident. But in the dot-com era, it became something else, and the latest iteration was largely been built to extract surplus information. In a political economy based on extracting surplus information, is civil society actually still possible? The internet today is no respecter of the difference between state, the domestic sphere, and civil society. It extracts surplus information out of both work and non-work. Everything is subordinated to it, or rather to the private interests that own and control it. Your Googles, Apples, Amazons, maybe the avatars, precursors of a new kind of ruling class. It gets worse. I have a book coming out on this, and the tagline is basically, what if this is not even capitalism anymore, it's something worse? I think it needs thinking at this juncture. In the United States, it used to be mostly space-binding media that were private interests, while the state still had the power to regulate. In part, this was because the state still had recourse to powerful time-binding institutions at arm's length from civil society as market. The university, the churches, the law, even Congress itself. But one can wonder if that's still the case. Both space and time-binding institutions are playground for a particular kind of private interest now, one whose whole means of production is the extraction of surplus information. The internet-based space and time-binding media on which what is left of the social runs is no longer coterminous with the territory of state. Google, Apple, Amazon, and the rest have their own post-national geographies, as Benjamin Bratt has, I think, usefully illustrated. It's no longer the case that the dominant space-binding media map onto the territory of the state and can thus be regulated by the state. On this terrain, three movements are happening sort of at the same time. One is a heightened struggle for inclusion in civil society as discourse and indeed as everyday life. The rise of the alt-right may actually be a sort of reaction or response to advances in the struggle to include everybody, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, or even citizenship status, in an expanded conception of civil society, one not limited to the brotherhood of entitled men. But on the other hand, this inclusion in civil society as discourse is up against a really effective movement to push more and more categories of people out of representative democracy through gerrymander, although Ruth Greenwood gives us reason to think that just because they're weird shapes doesn't mean they're bad districts, and I've thought more about that, so thank you, Ruth. Gerrymander, voter suppression, aggressive policing of citizenship. This results from the weakness of the organised forms through which those who are not gentlemen initially won power within civil society as discourse, and hence access to consideration by state. Think of the decline, particularly of trade unionism there. The third thing is an essentially sort of parasitic, uncivil, antisocial infrastructure or vector, which is simply sort of cannibalizing the domestic sphere of the state and civil society as discourse, as simply means to extract surplus information and hence control over the sphere of production. We have a new kind of ruling class with the means to reshape all social technical spheres in its interests. This is a ruling class that likes to talk a lot about innovation, but maybe because there's actually not that much actual innovation going on. It's not really possible to oppose this ruling class from outside of the space-binding and time-binding media it increasingly owns and controls. One can take refuge in the domestic or appeal to the state. One can't actually take refuge in the domestic or appeal to the state. It's hard to hide from it as surveillance is kind of like built into the vector. It extracts surplus information already from all spheres of life. And every struggle through civil society as discourse, or what is left of it, actually adds to the traffic in its networks and hence to its revenues. One struggles then in and against it. However, one can get a bit carried away with thinking of this as a society of control. It turns out these space-binding media are and always were noisy, chaotic, like much more than the dreams of early cybernetic theory ever made out. And actually, both in civil society as market and as discourse, there are now agents who specialize in extracting surplus information from volatility. And that'd be one of the things I'm kind of curious about the IRA and sort of Russian activities, is volatility, what's desired and traded on there as one trades in these things on markets. So I am worried about Russian oligarchs, and I really thank Jirija for like really detailed empirical work on exactly how that might work. But I'm also worried about American oligarchs. There's a kind of a discourse that's really mad about Russian oligarchs messing with our politics. That's the job of American oligarchs. You know, I'm kind of like not a fan of either, frankly. So if we just restore the role of American oligarchs against Russian ones, what have we really achieved, you know? So, you know, and when we're speaking of like other, you know, kind of in the bad sense, hacks of politics, this was one, and one that went on for decades, yeah, to make this possible. What is to be done? The thing to not do is subordinate this asocial incivility directly to the state, which seems to be the strategy of the Communist Party of China. But at least they actually seem to grasp how the space-binding vectoral infrastructure of the internet undermines time-binding institutions, including the state itself. So I'm not giving the CPC any props here, but other than that, I think they've identified the problem more. Yeah? In the long run, I'd wager that China's suppression of the noise of civil society as discourse will harm its decision-making and undermine the state that the strategy is meant to protect. So maybe we're better off with chaos and noise and our sort of flexible institutions. So what is to be done? Well, everything. I don't think just talk about ethics of technology really does much, because ethics doesn't come with sanctions, right? Without sanctions, ethics doesn't really do anything. And since our situation in some ways is unprecedented, we'll have to experiment and be open-minded. We'll need electoral strategies, we'll need direct action, we'll need tech worker organizing, which also came up earlier today. We'll need legal challenges, as we've also heard. Because that's where I come from, I think we underestimate the role of education. Even my allegedly savvy, God, I hate that word, 20-year-old liberal arts students actually have gaps in their knowledge of how the internet works and so forth. So even this supposedly tech literate constituency doesn't quite know all of what it's doing. And you know, we'll also need to produce a massive, really super cool memes that are just like better than the other sides. Things are bad. This hopefully will be my next Congress person. So who recognizes? Oh wow, it's like great. I just wanted to test whether Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was known on the other coast. Great. So yeah. So like on this level, it sort of can be done. You can identify. What'll get interesting is whether the constituency that got her elected has any leverage over her whatsoever once she's in Congress, right? Because we now have America always had very, very loose forms of party structure. So that's the one thing I'm still a little skeptical about there, is whether that can work. All right, so I don't really have like an upbeat last note for this. I actually think the situation is really super not good, and particularly when you think that we're sort of running out of time to address the climate change piece. So it's like, you know, I kind of think, for God's sake, can we get the wheels back on the truck so it works, so we can actually address this actually larger problem that'll kind of undermine the whole thing. So it's going to take a lot of hack and hacking, and so it's like broader and more friendly sense that Nicholas gave it right at the very beginning, that maybe needs recovering. Like there was a time, like in 18th century America, the word Democrat meant pretty much what the word terrorist means now, right? So like there's a politics to language, and that word was reclaimed. And so maybe hack is a word we could reclaim to make sure that we leave something as an incivil unsociety that is the United States for people to flourish in and pursue happiness in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you all so much for that. And I'm actually going to, I was sitting sort of frantically making notes and sort of connecting dots between the three presentations. And I think I'm actually just going to go to Erica's sort of final point, because I was thinking about, as you were talking about ad revenue and sort of the need to change these structures, I was thinking about Ken's point at the beginning about sort of the relationship between civil society and the market, and the fact that this is, you know, there are economic, we know that there are economic structures underlying the way that these things have been organized. Your point about, you know, do the executives care, and how do, you know, is it about getting them to care, or is it about getting everyone else to come up with different solutions? I mean, I imagine it's both. So I wanted to talk about, to ask everybody, and maybe sort of first to Erica, sort of a little bit more about sort of what do you see as the most successful examples of attempts to overcome some of these elements, especially to do with sort of the structures of these companies or these sites, and then sort of further, just how are there, to all of you, what are some examples of the attempt to build sort of solidarity between organizations or individuals?
I don't know that we've seen any good examples yet. This is all very, I guess I don't want to call it very new. Trying to destabilize societies is not a new thing, but the tool in which the tool that's being used to make it happen is just the new thing. So I guess we need to first figure out how we're going to help people build defenses for these tools, right? Like we know, everybody knows about like the propaganda flyers that were dropped out of airplanes during wars, and like, oh, we know to watch out for flyers dropped on our heads. But we don't equate that with like the memes that get reshared into our feeds and what have you. And so we need to start educating people about that. And I think that is on everybody, but especially the people running tech companies like Twitter and Facebook, building in something that helps people understand that they shouldn't just believe what they're reading, to do some research, to say, hey, this might not be true, maybe go look at some news sites, Google about it or something. And I know that's antithetical to their purposes. They want people to stay on their sites, but I think it's very important right now that we encourage people to go and learn more.
Well, to that point, the other suggestion you had was around the sort of need to enhance critical thinking, and I think this has come up a number of times during the day about how do we understand some of these trends. In terms of what the best ways are to foster critical thinking, I mean, I know, Burak, we've talked about Graph Commons as a platform that does do a lot of work to connect dots and to bring different ideas and sets of data together, but it also requires a high level of digital literacy to understand what's going on. And so I'm wondering if you perhaps could also, and maybe Ken too, can also speak to sort of what kind of skills do we need to be encouraging, and where and how does that process take place?
Maybe I can say a couple of things introduction here. I always imagined using those advanced tools against the ones who created that. For instance, tactics like feeds, having an activity feed in front of you, or mapping, complex things, complex systems. These tools are being used by governments and corporations for a very long time, since the 60s, I think, as far as I know. So taking that tool and making it public and easier to use was one motivation for me to create a tool like that. Which enabled a lot of people actually in the world to use this still. It's hard to get used to that a bit. It takes a bit of time, a bit of learning, but still when you have the tool in front of it, in your hands, you can really make interesting things and that are really useful. So it's all the people who are using Graph Commons more or less are mapping power in different worlds, different, in Brazil, in Hong Kong, in Turkey, in different places in the world. So I think I would say vectorless tactics used by activists could be a very interesting model to go for, and obviously these are all information systems, so they are by default collaborative. You can always mash up things and work together with people and so on.
Yeah, I'm just going to put it in those Haroldianist terms that if you've got a predominance of sort of space binding media that end up being kind of incredibly noisy, and also where the money is always to be made both on noise and positive feedback loops. The thing to really double down on is your sort of time-binding forms, education, law, the state, which are all of the things being kind of cannibalized at the moment by what I'm calling vectoral forms that are actually subordinating those to things that are space-binding again. So it's we'll just turn education into a business and subject it to metrics. It's the whole point of it is that it's not subject to, temporary ebbs and flows and fads and fashions and things. There's some sort of resistance to that. So you can kind of complain that institutions of law and education and culture are a little slow on these things, but that's sort of the point of them, that they're supposed to be outside of the cycle of temporary fascination. So I think, ironically, the sort of progressive strategy includes, among other things, thinking about deep institutional forms. And obviously not everything about institutions one could love, right? But what is it about the form? Rather than thinking all of this is just a thing about equipping an individual. That's sort of part of the problem, that it's all just then, it's on you as an individual to go out there in this information storm and have at that without a jacket. It's that's not really going to work.
Right, and actually that's something that with public knowledge we thought a lot about, is that how do we think about maintenance rather than disruption? Right. How do we think about enabling people through these institutions, bolstering those institutions? And it reminds me of what Ingrid was talking about this morning. So this question of the accountability vacuum, but also this sort of the idea that infrastructure has been hacked effectively and appropriated by something like Facebook, this idea of social infrastructure being just Facebook. And it reminds. So I'm gonna quote quote actually something from you, Ken, about this, or at least about this question of infrastructure. So if the attempt to negate or accelerate history runs up against the inertia of the infrastructure on which it runs, then perhaps it's a question not of breaking or speeding that infrastructure, but designing a different one. This would require collaborative action among the subordinated classes. The difference among such classes cannot be wished away by branding it the multitude or by imposing by fiat a kind of philosophical universalism. It means an approach to coalition building that's more about economic agents than merely political ones. As in most versions of radical democracy, it is time to build a new infrastructure within the ruins of the old. So sorry to throw that at you right here, but I sort of feel like that's sort of building on what you're talking about. Could you say a little bit more about what your thoughts about that new infrastructure and how we can think about doing that?
Yeah, I got a bit of this from Benjamin Bratton, and he sort of just phrased it as an offhand comment. It's like, can this infrastructure be the means to build another one? Because the thing is, this one isn't enduring. We've sort of built a very, very, and who's we? But we're inside a very, very temporary infrastructure that doesn't know how to even quantify its own inputs. We're using something like, the amount of energy it takes to run Germany, to run an internet, that doesn't even, know what the value of anything is. So, like, that's just not going to endure. We all know that. So, what is the sort of multiple agents in their particularity that might have things to contribute to rethinking that and rebuilding that and redesigning that? There isn't any sort of universalism you can put over the top of this. This is always going to be a kind of a coalition effort, if you like. Because I just kind of think that's the game at the moment. It's going to build another infrastructure now or game over.
I think that the other infrastructure is being built already, right? Like there are so many ML, AI, VR things happening in tech right now. And I wonder if we need to start thinking about how our society will behave both positively and negatively on those in that infrastructure. Like what is it going to look like when everybody has a VR headset? I mean, it's going to happen at some point, right? And so like it may not be like the big giant thing that people stick on their heads today. It may look different, but there will be a point where everybody will have some sort of entree into the world of VR. Like it's like where you have TVs and computers today. And so like what's that going to look like? And I think it's important to think about that sort of thing instead of focusing a lot on like our issues right now. Like we need to start planning for that.
I kind of just a little comment on what you said. Like I always think that those machines, however, like their forms are but they are always about like data capture. Like they capture even more dense, stuff in our lives, basically from your pockets, from your, everyday life or whatever. Like even higher resolutions of capture from your life, so that it makes more money. And I think it's simple logic. I think there's nothing. New about this. It's been like this for the past 20 years. I think we should all see this and then just go beyond that. Like, how can you, create your own data capture tools about themselves who are making those tools out there, and then use it against them? I find it more like proactive, a bit like, resistance against, those kind of powers out there, the new information powers. So
how do we motivate it? How do we motivate a populace to be that interested in going out and creating their own tools, right? Like we are very much a consumer-driven society where people are just like, I'm just going to take in all this information, and not very many people are like, I'm going to make the tools that I use or that people use to take in the information. So how do we motivate people to do that?
Has to be fun and sexy, and it sort of can't be a kind of moral obligation. That's
right.
The thing. I don't think that's terribly motivating for most people, at least for some, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the urgencies, they come obviously to your life. Some of the work I just presented here were that because they were urgent to do. I was doing maps for a very long time ago, but at that moment, I created this interesting, vectors. They came together, all these people, in the park and so on, and we had to do this thing somehow, and then became very, very useful over time. And we didn't create another Twitter-like tool. We created a completely different tool, and And people talk about, like right now as an example, like we can make alternatives to Twitter or Facebook. We can create. I can program on Twitter actually myself, but the thing is, it doesn't matter, right? As long as you don't have network effects built in it. So this is the general problem we have. The data capture and then control, actually the control of the flow of data, and which creates network effects, which creates more power for the digital, for the oligarchs. Yeah.
Just one thing before we open up to the audience. I think, Erica, your point about motivation is really interesting. So vis-a-vis Burak's work, so Zaina just mentioned sort of political urgency. We've been talking about the fact that even among organizations and individuals for whom data sharing is really important because it's really fundamental to their work, it's actually really hard to get people to do that, even in the spirit of civic data or data solidarity or just sort of building a better society. Yeah. And yet, the reason that it was possible in Turkey was because of that very, very sort of like acute political urgency and the stress of that moment. So obviously we've been talking today about lots of senses in which there is tremendous political urgency here right now, and I think it is a great question, what's going to motivate us? Similarly with climate change, what is going to be the point at which we decide that this cannot go on? But I think on that note, perhaps we should open up to questions from the floor.
Okay, I'll get us started actually.
Great.
I don't know if you guys know about this research, and I don't remember exactly where it came from, but it's basically the 80-20 rule that like 80% of people in online communities just participate and consume, as you pointed out. 20%, and I'm going to get the numbers exactly wrong, but it's approximately like that, do participate and sort of contribute a little bit, and then it's like 1 to 2% that actually are content generators. So I actually wonder if you don't have to motivate that 80%, they're not contributing anyway. Maybe you just have to focus on that 1 to 2% and get them to build the right tools that shape the behavior of the 20%. Seems like it might be easier. Thoughts?
Yeah, as a kind of department chair and former associate dean, I'm sort of aware of the other version of this, which is that 20% of the people are going to take up 80% of your time. I've heard that used in a quite different kind of context as well. But yes, true. You can spend a little bit too much time thinking about majorities rather than thinking about like who are key actors in particular communities. There's sort of interesting studies of like network effects of how somebody starts smoking because the central person in that group does, and so you want to get to the people who are the cores to their particular communities. But that's organizing. Like that's what organizing has always been about. Yeah. It's like, who is the person who motivates the other, 10, 12 people around them?
Thank you so much. At the end of the panel, especially, or generally in the panel, media literacy was brought up. Is this good? Yeah. Okay. So, okay. I'll be hidden behind it. But there was this push for media literacy and critical thinking, and as educators, for instance, for me, it's very important in my teaching to bring up media literacy right now. But as we're moving forward, media literacy is a very contested area. Like, there is information and misinformation everywhere, and what does that even mean? Where you can find anything to basically prove your point or find truth for whatever you're trying to advocate for. So what does that look like? Like, what are our sources for media literacy that we want our younger generation to look for, perhaps? And I feel like the media literacy right now and our conversation around it has created also this skepticism towards, truth. So I would love to hear your thoughts about what does that look like.
I think if I were an educator, I'm not an educator, I just write code and manage people, not nearly as important as an educator. I would want to teach students not about like specific sources, but sort of like debate club style, like prove both sides, like prove yourself wrong, prove yourself right? And then I think that is a great way to teach kids how to think critically, and also to kind of question all their sources, because if they go through, if they enter adulthood and life knowing, excuse me, that there can be a way to prove yourself right and wrong for any subject, then it makes them start questioning everything, right? And I think that is an important way of thinking, especially now. I don't know if I answered your question at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated.
Yeah.
Because I come from, the sort of Australian version of British cultural studies, and that version of media literacy is all about the opposite. It's about class solidarity, and then how you actually build that out when you realise that that's a limited frame. That if you like, popular sovereignty was the goal. So, but it's all about structure of feeling. It's not about your individual attributes and ability to do things as a sole agent. It's kind of the opposite model of what that was. It's about belonging.
Yeah. Hi. I don't know if I'll word this correctly, but I have a question about something that's come up across the day, I think. It's this recourse to a kind of national or nationalistic kind of discourse. And I wonder to what extent the kinds of planetary scale, planetary platform issues we're faced with can be dealt with through that frame. And I think like Burak's work is kind of beautiful. It emerges from a specific set of circumstances, a specific situation, a location, but it's used across the globe to counter or to operate both within and against these kind of vectors. So I don't know, I'm just curious about that kind of national framing.
If you're talking about, as we have a lot today, we're talking about law or the political space, then the national frame has to be primary. But then one can wonder, firstly, if it's undermined by another kind of technical form at the moment, more so than in the past. And history of international communication is something I used to do, and the way states have jockeyed around everything from telegraphy has a long history. So one can focus a little too much on the national, even looking back in time. But as a diasporic person who's not even a citizen here, it's kind of like, oh, that state's your problem. Kind of in the cultural space, you might be more interested in what flows between and what's interstitial, and get a little bit out of that space. But it is really key if you want to talk about law or politics, and as one legitimately needs to around these issues.
I can say like a couple of things as a comment on what you said. Like after this initial map we made in Turkey 2013, it was 14 or 15, I think. We went to Brazil, Sao Paulo, and then Hong Kong, different places in the world. Hong Kong right after the umbrella movement, and Brazil before the election there, and after FIFA. Well, the thing is, like in these cities, what we did is like we organized these workshops with the different activists who use these techniques of mapping, relationships to map their own local, stories, which I wasn't able to read them anyways. They are in Portuguese and in Sao Paulo, for instance, but I was able to at least help them with the very basic methodologies, like where to look at, basically simple methods. But they were able to make very interesting maps of, for instance, the companies who are extractors in the Amazon forest, but at the same time supporting, those certain political parties in the election as funders and so on and so forth. They were able to make those bridges in a hand-drawn map. Actually, it was very fun. Similarly, in Hong Kong, there was like activist groups who were obviously mapping the tycoons, let's say, in Hong Kong and China, and how the mainland is kind of has this huge powers on Hong Kong and so on and so forth. Those kind of stories were mapped. But the thing is, do they continue this work? Probably not. And it was a one workshop, but there's an interesting thing there. Like you have to. I think data work is always high maintenance. Like we have to really continue updating your stuff because things change all the time. If you want that map or data set to be a reference for anyone to use. So it's like keeping a data record continuously, like archivist, but it has to be constant because power changes very quickly. Yeah, so that's a big challenge in this type of work usually, and even we are kind of suffering in our own projects to be able to continue these like data mapping work. Basically, it's quite difficult. Yeah.
I just had a thought. This was sort of, to me, was obvious. Like I'm from a small country, so you take it for granted in a small country that any event in the domestic political space is shaped by transnational actors. You just take that for granted. But I think that realization's just come to the United States. Because the big country that thought, you know, like, we're the center, and it's like, you're not. Like, transnational actors have always affected it, but now, like, much more obviously so. So it's like, welcome to the world.
Well, I think that the US has largely been the people doing the acting on, and we are in the position of being acted upon now, and like people are like, oh my gosh, this is so terrible and scary and bad. It's like we've been doing it for a long time ourselves. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot of schadenfreude about that out there, but they won't tell you that. People tell me that, like my Chilean friends, like, you know.
Hello. Throughout the conference and through many of the new media events, actually, not just this one, my mind goes to spot, well, when Erica was speaking, and it's like, you know, well, what's it going to be like? And I'm like, it's clear. It's going to be like 1984. It's going to be like Brave New World. I mean, if the end of this period of chaos is going to be stability, those are two easily decipherable versions. And I think McKenzie wasn't too far from that either. It's like, well, what can we do about it? And so then I've been struggling. It's like, well, I don't want to say anything because it's just, you know, the depression of helplessness is not going to help us do anything. But what if we just run with it? What if we just say that take like a long historical version? I mean, what is civil society? What if it's an accident of the distribution of media that was available, say from 1500 to now, that we had writing and printing disseminated quickly, but it took a long time for people to read. You had to study it. This whole idea that we want to study, we want to think about what to do, we want to have a plan. Every time we hear we have a plan, it's like, oh, that's discovered. I mean, just living in the world of email and Twitter and everything like that, it's planning is just goes away. I mean, you can't keep any idea in your head for very long before something else comes along, bumps it off. What if the thing is that we don't use the model of something else? We don't try to apply the model of the way we were raised to think, and just, I mean, it sounds like grasping at straws, but I mean, just very different things that we can, I mean, stability will happen eventually, or, well, some other models of stability besides the two unappealing ones that I just mentioned. They're not so not looking for a plan, obviously, because that'll just be repeating the past. How do we make ourselves more open to radically new?
It's sort of stability or bust. Like we only have models for information systems that are open and you can just dump waste heat somewhere, which is what we've been doing, you know, since the Industrial Revolution began. But we've sort of realized actually that's over. Like we're already at constraint. So the fun thing is, you know, this civilization is over. We all really know it. But what would it mean to build another one in the middle of it? Like that's the fun part, is we get to do that. But it has to be an open experiment. Like we actually don't have models. And that cuts through a lot of the arguments about this or that. It's an open experiment as to what forms are kind of endurable and inhabitable now. So like have at it, you know, like make some new stuff and see if it'll stick. See if it'll deal, particularly with unstable climate, because we don't really have any experience with how to do that, and that's where we now are.
I feel that there are people that I feel might be most qualified to do something big like that are busy trying to reproduce that.
Yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead.
The thing keeps reproducing itself on an expanding scale as more of the same. Like that's the kind of the problem. It's an infrastructure that builds more of itself. So whether it can change course or not, that's the open question.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Mine will be a self-critique a bit, so it's going to be both you and Ken actually, because I'm like, you know, even with the civic data project where we like, you know, scrape data, or when we play with data, we always actually adopt the data that has some sort of legitimacy behind it. So we always rely on some sort of like forms or formats that governments, like, you know, invented at one point of their, like, you know, rigorous, like, you know, tools of control. I mean, when you take a country like ours, like, you know, maybe to a degree Burak was able to, like, you know, convey that, but, you know, those time binding and space binding infrastructures are actually collapsing and becoming a one whole blob of themselves. I mean, it's like there's no more this divide where you can, like, you know, label some actors corporate or some actors like, you know, state actors, or those, like, you know, the tension or the conflict between the code and the law was, like, you know, ended in the victory of the law, right? I mean, the law had its, like, you know, weird ways of infiltrating to the infrastructure in Turkey and created a new type of internet environment that maybe is a lot telling for the American audience, but they have no idea. Maybe that's, like, you know, like, you know, activism, or like how you carry the information to the first world that is actually clueless about what, like, you know, kind of embezzlement of these technologies can a state do. And I was wondering, like, I observed this, like, you know, even in our work with Burak, we always rely on that legitimacy that, like, government provides. So the data gets to be the victim of the crude forms of the form. So I was wondering, how can one, like, it's sort of like this also, the fantasy as a genre question, right? Like, I mean, you're bound by the material of what you have, like, in your playfulness. So how come that, like, you know, we always, like, you know, have to go back to certain times of space binding legitimacy in such context that we will be able to actually find a new infrastructure within the old one? How is it, like, you know, going to be possible in such blending of space and time bindings, like infrastructures?
It may have happened before, is the thing, and you know, at the risk of being sort of vulgar Marxist about it, when you sort of like change the mode of production, like it always sort of just plows through all of the political cultural infrastructures on top of it, and you have to sort of re-establish them all over again. And it's sort of to think it might be on that level, that this is not just, you know, making a few change corrections, but you know, quite new institutional forms might be required. They never really happen ex nihilo, like they always have precedents, so it won't be entirely new. But the level of institutional innovation required might be very, very high, as it was at the founding of the Republic, right? Like, so it's sort of like, we've done this before. And so I think in the American context, to seize hold of that, this was a place that innovated institutionally and now doesn't. And how do you do that again? Like, to get that rather than to always be beholden to this sort of sacred form as if it was forever, when clearly it's not.
I was thinking, like, you know, one thing you said is very interesting. The experiments the governments of, like, Turkey or maybe Russia or China is conducting in their own, you know, infrastructures is going to be probably taken by the governments in the Europe and US soon. This should be a warning, because the thing is, as an example, the government in Turkey is doing deep package inspection. That means even if you use a VPN in order to go, you know, kind of at least hide from their eyes while you're navigating the web or whatever you do on the internet, deep package inspection actually allows to even, you know, traverse and track those type of activities of what you do. So they, you know, they basically follow you as you navigate to different places. This inspection boat or whatever. I don't know how exactly it works, but basically this technique should be not allowed, obviously, in any infrastructure. But you know, it's like a force, like, by law they enabled this. Like, you cannot do anything against that. Like, if you know, there's even bigger problems than this in Turkey, but this was itself very strong. And with the net neutrality discussion in the US, this is the next step. I mean, there will be deep package inspection in this country too, and that will be very alarming, because that means all of your, whatever technology you use, even Tor doesn't matter, you'll be tracked very easily by the government authorities or the telecommunication companies who run that infrastructure for whatever different profit needs, but they are regulated by the government at some point. So kind of those countries like Turkey and you know, maybe Poland or, you know, Russia, China, they become like laboratories for governments like US, I think. This is kind of interesting for kind of how to use oppression in the future. Yeah.
So yet another cautionary tale today. I'm going to thank our panelists, Erica, Ken, and Burak, very much for joining us. I'm also going to just give a plug that you're interested in hearing more about the Civic Data Solidarity Project. We have copies of the working paper that Burak has just finished outside on the table, and I'm also going to plug that Burak is running introductory workshop for Graph Commons at the main branch of the San Francisco Public Library tomorrow at 1 p.m., I believe. That's on Larkin Street in San Francisco if you're interested in learning more about that platform, or if you know anyone who might be interested. It's free and it's open to the public. And then I think we're just going to stretch our legs perhaps, or we're going to go straight in. We're going to stretch our legs, and then we're going to come back and for our keynote. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dina.